Welcome to a new wave of entrepreneurship. I'm Latifa Farah, Associate Creative Producer at Venture for Canada and the producer of a new wave of entrepreneurship. The focus of this podcast is to hear from changemakers and Canadian entrepreneurs to learn about how they've developed their entrepreneurial mindset and skills. In Season 7, we'll be chatting with CEOs, founders, and successful business leaders about their career journeys. We're excited to dive into these conversations about how to foster your entrepreneurial mindset and drive. On this episode, we're joined by Reid. In a world of ever-accelerating and often exhausting levels of change, offers people tools to activate their adaptability with minimal fuss and maximal joy. He does this through The Making Box, a company he co-founded in 2013. Since then, Jay has led adaptability training and team development programs at organizations across the globe, including Shopify, Google, RBC, Loblaws, Danube University Krems, and hundreds more. In this episode, Scott and Jay will discuss ways to increase your adaptability.
I am super excited to be interviewing Reid, who is the founder of The Making Box on Venture for Canada's podcast, A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. Jay, how are you doing this afternoon?
Great. How are you?
I am doing fantastic. And we're just talking about positivity and how there's some positive days and there's some not positive days. But today is a positive day.
Yeah. Yesterday started with fire, literal fire for me. It was my partner's birthday, and Cass opened their gift and set the tissue paper right beside a candle. And we were so sleepy. It was like 7 a.m, and we were just kind of getting out of bed, and then like, oh no. And I grabbed this tissue paper and I start to like walk it to the sink. And by the time I've like taken 2 steps, it's like a full fireball. And anyway, today, not as chaotic out of the gate.
That is a very intense way to especially start someone's birthday. But it reminds me, I've actually had a similar experience where once I was in Nova Scotia and we were celebrating Christmas. And so it was Christmas dinner. And for some reason, the power went out 30 minutes before Christmas dinner. So we had 30 people and there was all these little candles on all the table because there's no electricity in the house. And somebody had a paper napkin and it just lit on fire, and it legitimately almost set the whole like house on fire. Like it was like an emergency. So it's to say those paper tissues can be dangerous in terms of fire. It can be a scary way to start the day. So all this is a great a lead up to the fact that there's a lot of uncertainty and there's lots of randomness. You never know how a day is going to get started, including potentially with fire. So, Jay, we're going to talk about a lot of things today, but predominantly we're going to talk about adaptability and the importance of it and what is adaptability. So, as a first kind of opening thought for you, what exactly is adaptability?
I'm glad we're starting here because I feel like the word adaptability often gets used interchangeably with flexibility, resiliency, and sometimes it's sort of said as like be more adaptable, and that means like get with the program, kind of that kind of energy, right? So I think understanding adaptability, what it is an important place to start. And we could go to definitions from the American Psychological Society. We could look at academic papers. The definition that we use, that we found most utility with, is that adaptability is your capacity to change or be changed to achieve optimal fitness within a given environment. And I like that definition because without getting too academic, it implies kind of the contextual and temporal nature of adaptability, right? A choice in one moment, in one time, in one environment might be advantageous or optimal, whereas that same choice in another moment or in another environment is not optimal. And so adaptability is about fitness and within an environment, and that the word optimal asks, what are we trying to achieve in that environment?
So you're the founder of The Making Box. Can you describe a little bit what is The Making Box and how has adaptability helped you in your entrepreneurial journey?
So The Making Box is a group of humans who believe that adaptability is the skill of the future, that it is vital to the health and well-being of us as individuals and as organizations. So we offer teams tools to assess and develop their adaptability at work and in the classroom. And we seek to do so with minimal fuss and maximal joy. So for us, it isn't a question of can we adapt or not adapt? We think that you'll figure it out, you'll find a way, but why not try to adapt in a way that's energizing rather than depleting? So our clients include large organizations like Shopify, Google, RBC, Loblaws. We work inside of universities and inside of governments. And we also operate on a buy one, give one model. So that brings us into nonprofits and charities and even prisons. And our company started in 2013. And don't tell anyone, though, it started as an improv comedy theater.
And Venture for Canada has been a lucky beneficiary of the buy one, give one model, which I think is a fantastic system. And it's a great way to increase accessibility and to serve charity and nonprofit clients. So thanks so much for your support, Jay. And that's how we initially got connected. And I know the Venture for Canada Fellows loved your session at training camp in May, June 2022. So one thing that I want to dive a little deeper, double click on, is the improv sessions in prisons. How did that work? How did they emerge as a client? And how did you structure the session?
Yeah, so this one was within a women's penitentiary in Kitchener-Waterloo. So it was my co-founder, Haley, that actually led this session or sessions. And it's through an organization called Walls to Bridges. And Haley would be able to tell you a lot more in detail about the sessions themselves and sort of the connection. What I can say is that Walls to Bridges, from my understanding, is an organization that has educational opportunities in partnership with this penitentiary and the University of Waterloo. And so they run university programming inside of the prison. So the classes are full of people that are students at the Waterloo that might be living outside, and also students that are living inside. And so we were engaged to explore improvisational activities as a way of bonding the groups.
Sounds very impactful. Can you describe in a little bit more detail, how does improv foster adaptability?
In order to answer that, it would be probably most helpful to dive into the science of adaptability. And adaptability is a very complex capacity. And one way that I found it helpful to break down the complexity of adaptability is through the ACE model. And this is a model of adaptability that's used within the adaptability quotient assessment that is offered by AQAI, and they're a company that we're partners with. So what is the ACE model of adaptability? The A stands for abilities. The C stands for characteristics, and the E stands for environment. So within each of these domains, there are 5 subdomains. So within the ability section of our adaptability, there are some highly plastic skills. These are the developable components of adaptability, and they would include things like resilience, our mindset, our mental flexibility, and our ability to unlearn. Big part of adaptability is letting go of behaviors and patterns that no longer serve us. So the abilities are kind of the highly plastic and developable components of our adaptability. The characteristics are sort of the semi-stable personality components of your adaptability. And these are ranges, right? Are you someone who plays to protect or plays to win? Are you someone who's focused on the details or the bigger picture? Are you generally fearful or are you generally hopeful? And This is how you interpret change in your life. And then the last piece is your environment, right? Our environment affects our adaptability. This things that would be measured in there are the support that you feel from your team, your stress levels at work, your emotional health in that environment. And so in order to answer the question of how might improvisation help us adapt, it's zooming into some of those smaller components of adaptability, right? And so, and what are the more plastic components of our adaptability? So if we wanted to understand a little bit more about what is the benefit of improvisation, then we could link that to some of the subdomains of adaptability. And improvisation has been shown to increase our creativity and psychological well-being, our interpersonal confidence, our adaptive selling skills, our tolerance for uncertainty, and even group collaboration, and reduce things like anxiety associated with perfectionism, depression in adults. And so when we look at the ACE model and we see an ability like mental flexibility and mindset, we could see that training in improvisation would develop those abilities and thus develop our adaptability. We could also see how improvisation training in groups could affect the environment side of adaptability too, increasing psychological safety, team support, company support, reducing stress.
It's fascinating and a testament to that adaptability is not an innate thing, that somebody isn't just born adaptable, that somebody has to develop their adaptability muscles every day. And yeah, and going with the flow. I mean, I reflect even my own, I think improv is a fantastic way to do it, but there's other ways. Part of it is, in the past, reflecting my own life, I love planning trips. And in the past, I used to be really specific about the planning of my trips. Oh, I'm going to do this specific thing and I need to do it. And I still do research on trips, but a little bit more now like, oh, let's go with the flow. Some of the most fun things are the things that you just happen upon in life. And there's so many ways to like, that's just one example, but I think to your point, there's so many ways to build your adaptability muscles every single day. What are some other ways that are of interest beyond improv that you think somebody can build in a daily practice of building that adaptability muscle?
If you're to develop adaptability, you'll probably want to ask yourself a few questions first. Why do you want to adapt? And what is the outcome that you're hoping to achieve? As we were talking about, adaptability is your ability to change to achieve optimal fitness within a given environment. So knowing what you want to achieve or feel is kind of key to understanding and then developing adaptability. After you know kind of why you want to adapt and what the outcome is that you want to achieve, then you might want to ask yourself, what is my current relationship with change and uncertainty? What does that look like? How quickly do I want to change? And then from there, kind of asking ourselves, what's the right framework or levers, I should say, to pull in order to be more adaptable in my context, in my environment? It is such a unique, personalized skill that there's kind of no blanket thing to offer someone that's going to generally lead to more adaptability, because you might be in an environment that is restricting your adaptability. So maybe changing that environment is going to lead to greater adaptability. Or maybe you are lacking in one of the ability components of adaptability, like your mental flexibility. So then in order to improve mental flexibility, it might be subjecting yourself to uncertainty and trying to associate uncertainty and unknowing and gray areas with a positive emotion rather than fear or stress.
What is mental flexibility?
The way that I would define mental flexibility and the way that it's defined within the adaptability quotient assessment is our ability to live in gray zones without it stressing us out.
And what I'm hearing from you is this inherent link between adaptability and resilience. It's to say that they're two different things, as you mentioned at the beginning, but they're inherently interrelated. That if you have a massive setback, particularly if the setback has nothing to do with you, everyone gets unlucky in life. How do you bounce back? And so my question to you is, can you go into a little bit more detail? What is the link between adaptability and resilience in face of adverse life events?
In the parlance of the adaptability quotient in the ACE model, resilience would be a skill, an ability within adaptability, alongside things like mental flexibility, unlearning. So, what is resilience? How does it differ from adaptability? Resilience, like you've shared, is about bouncing back from negative situations. So if we were to improve our resilience, then we will inherently improve our adaptability. However, if we're looking at adaptability writ large, that might not be the most important skill for you to develop to become more adaptable.
And it's interesting the extent to which adaptability interplays with so many different competencies and skills. In some ways, adaptability is this catalyst for all of these other capabilities. That if you don't have adaptability, it's more challenging to be resilient. And potentially, it's also more challenging to be creative. And that was one thing that I found in research in advance of this interview is lots of people have studied that link between adaptability and creativity, and how if you're not adaptable, it's really challenging to be a creative person. What exactly is this link between adaptability and creativity?
Yeah, I think there's probably a lot of components of adaptability and creativity that are shared, and I think what links adaptability and creativity to me is that both of these capacities require practice to develop and a low stakes environment of psychological safety to engage in order to develop them, right? So when we think about creativity, some of the fears that might prevent us or block us from creativity, borrowing from Creative Confidence, the book Creative Confidence, they might be the messy first step or being judged or the fear of the unknown, right? So I think adaptability and creativity share that commonality where we need to kind of have a low stakes practice space to develop these skills where we delay immediate valuation and judgment.
I remember reading a little while ago about a study, and it was talking about the importance that when you give a team a new project that is highly creative in nature, to not set targets too soon. So to give time for creative work. That let's say it's a juicy creative project. For the first 6 months, don't put really intense milestones. Just let people think and work. Because sometimes putting really strict milestones too early on, it crushes that adaptability muscle. It says, oh, you need to do this by this date, and it becomes a very prescriptive approach. So in essence, to the point about creativity, is if you're trying to be a creative person, what I'm hearing from you and from the research is don't go out and say, okay, this is my year-long plan to do this invention. Instead, say, okay, these are some of the questions that I have. This is what I want to explore. I'm going to work really hard, but also recognize that I'm going to be really adaptable along the way, because when you're creating something new, there's no, to your point, certainty is your enemy in many cases. There is no roadmap. All you have is a compass, and you have to go with the flow.
Exploring the links between adaptability and creativity, it could be helpful to define what we think of as creativity and what we think of as adaptability, right? And like you mentioned, the research shows that adaptability is linked with greater creative output. The mechanisms behind that, unclear to me at this point. Haven't done my research on that specifically. But if we think of creativity as the ability to generate new and useful ideas, and adaptability as our capacity to change to achieve optimal fitness within a given environment, we could see how there might be some overlaps between those two capacities.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of interlinking between the two. One other area that I would love to dive deeper in is the concept of yes and, which I know is something that is talked a lot about a lot in improv, and I feel like has gone into the broader vernacular is something that people talk about. First off, what does yes and mean?
So you asked a question about yes and, which is a very common improv principle. And before we explore yes and, I think it might be valuable to your audience to understand what improv is and what improv isn't, because we all kind of come to that word with different perceptions and maybe misconceptions as well. So let's start with the word improvisation, because improv obviously is a shortened version of that word. And so when we introduce the idea of improvisation to groups, we'll usually ask them, who here has improvised? And if there's 100 people in the room, maybe 20 people will raise their hand and say that they've improvised before. And then we'll ask them, who here has ever had a conversation with a human being before? And then they'll all chuckle and raise their hand, because they're coming to the realization that whether they like it or not, being a human means being an improviser. And as much as we make plans, have goals, there's always going to be things that we discover in the moment, good and bad. So improvisation is just about reacting to the unforeseen. And improv refers generally to unscripted, often comedic performance, right? Where actors get a suggestion from the audience and they create something based on that suggestion. And it's where process and product co-occur. Both the audience and the performers discover the show at the same time. Now, you might also hear the words applied improvisation. And what applied improvisation describes is a growing field that explores the application of the principles and practices of theatrical improvisation, but beyond the scope of theater spaces, and using these skills to foster an ability to thrive in volatile, uncertain, and rapidly changing environments. And often when people think of improv, they first think of comedy, and that the idea of applied improvisation might be new to them, using improv for non-theater and non-comedic contexts. And oddly, if you kind of go back into the history of improvisation, it started as a tool for social and emotional development. So in the 1930s, there was a woman named Viola Spolin, and Viola Spolin was given a grant from the Chicago government to actually develop a way for immigrant children coming from all sorts of different places all over the world to bond and develop social skills. And so Viola Spolin invented these theater games that are used to today to practice improvisation. And it wasn't until later that Viola Spolin's son, Paul Sills, started using these activities to train actors. And Paul Sills then became one of the co-founders of Second City. And so you can see how then these tools that were initially used for social and emotional development were then used to train actors, and then they were used to as a performance. And so applied improvisation is about kind of going back to the original use of these tools to help people thrive in volatile and uncertain environments. So yes, and to get back to your initial question, is one of the principles that theatrical improvisers use to collaborate effectively. And there's a lot of misconceptions that come up when we zoom into the world of improv. One of them is that you need to be a silly extrovert in order to be a good improviser. That's just not true. Another is that your ability to improvise is fixed or innate, right? This is a developable skill. Another one is that improv training is about lying or telling jokes. And then the last two might be that improvisers don't prepare. And the reality is that they do prepare. They just don't prepare like theater actors and rehearse their lines. They prepare more like firefighters and basketball players, where they move through skill building activities and practice and training, a million free throws. So then when the game is on, the pressure is on, they can react to the unforeseen in a positive way, and sort of build this tolerance around uncertainty and develop this relaxed alertness in rapid change. The last piece of misconception would be that improv is random. Bad improv is random, and good improv is deeply connected and often leaves people feeling like, wow, that must have been planned. And so, in order to prepare and avoid this kind of randomness, improvisers have a variety of collaboration tools that they use. And one of them is yes and.
And I think yes and is such a helpful mindset to just go through life with. That I remember when I first started doing Venture for Canada, I often would meet people and they'd say, that's a bad idea. And they felt like they didn't even like consider the idea. And now since then, when people propose new ideas to me, I try to think more from that yes and. How do I add value rather than just saying, that's a bad idea, I don't want to do it? And I think it's a really interesting thing in life that if more people in the world had the mindset, yes and, we would have more creativity, we would have more new things. Because the reality is that inertia is natural, that inertia is the state of the world. It requires energy to break the inertia. And the only way we break the inertia that holds us back in the world from tackling the greatest challenges is through a yes and approach, which is why improv is so important. And the only other point I'll share as well, when you were speaking, it reminded me of my own life experience and what were certain things that helped me to foster adaptability. And one was doing competitive debating, of which probably I did debating maybe 10 tournaments a year, and each tournament would have 6 or 7 different debates that were each an hour long. And 90% of those, you got the topics 10 minutes before, and then you had to do this hour debate. And that was a fantastic learning experience, different than improv, but related in the sense that you just it was sort of a muscle memory over time. Yeah, I didn't know what the topic was, but you can start to form pattern recognition, and you fundamentally, just psychologically, your fear goes away. The more you get exposed to something, the less scary. I remember when I first started, it was super scary. I share these personal experiences because I think that they're potentially illustrative to listeners, that there are so many ways to develop adaptability. And one of the most important things is to like our earlier conversation, put yourself out there, put yourself in situations where there is uncertainty, where you have to adapt, and over a while it gradually becomes less scary.
Yeah, exactly, right. It's that exposure therapy and matching that to a positive emotion.
Exactly. And to your point that we live in an increasingly volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world, to use the VUCA term that we've mentioned on this podcast, which I do not term, but is a term that was created in the 80s by the U.S. War College, and is a term that's often used by the U.S. military and has kind of been co-opted in a lot of business environments. But one of the things I often think about in the context of Venture for Canada and just career development is, to earlier points in the conversation, if people don't develop adaptability, I think if people don't have a degree of that adaptability muscle built, it is so challenging to have any kind of career in our current world. And that's why the kind of work that you do is so critical. So I think it's something that it is amazing that you have your partnership with nonprofits and charities, because I think that your work is incredibly valuable for corporate clients, but also that as people think about education systems and fostering adaptable youth, the kinds of programs you do are the things that should be embedded within education programs. And to your point, that's how improv first started. It was to help kids. It was to help develop these socio-emotional skills. So it's amazing what you're doing. I think it can be so impactful for so many people.
There is research to show that practicing improvisation can reduce social anxiety in adolescence. And I think there likely is, as with language learning, some of those critical zones, right? And while a lot of these improvisational exercises were developed for kids, it's almost as if their simplicity and their joyfulness sort of tricks us into practicing them more and making them of an attractive place, right? Because often when we think about improvising, usually someone will say like, oh, I could never do that, right? That's like one of the most common things that we hear. And so it's almost as if we need some ways to make the practice of going into those places of uncertainty, having kind of that gymnasium where you can go back over and over and over again to develop that and not leave completely shattered. Right? Because we can adapt to the world. There's lots of things that we've had to adapt to, but how do we make a practice of that in a way that's energizing rather than depleting? And I imagine with your debate experience, there was some positive emotion that came out of that stress, and likely that stress reduced and reduced and reduced as you moved through that.
Well, it relates to in essence, I think what we're talking about is the self-efficacy of adaptability, or fostering adaptability, of which for our listeners, self-efficacy is in essence the belief in yourself, of your ability to perform a specific task or objective. And it's to say that there are many factors that influence self-efficacy, one of which is mastery. Like in essence, quite logically, if you succeed at something, you're more likely to have a belief that you have self-efficacy because you have proven that you have done it. So to your point, that's what the great thing about improv is how can you put people in a low risk sandbox type environment where they're out there, they're putting themselves out there, they're developing that adaptability skill. And you know what? If they mess up and it's not funny, or if it's not, there's no grade. Like it's a sandbox where they can build that muscle in a low stakes kind of way that doesn't harm their self-efficacy in the sense of their belief to be adaptable. And it's an interesting meditation, I think, also on the importance of games, and how games, both in the sense of, can be incredibly helpful for personal development, not just in sense of adaptability, but across so many other different spheres of human life.
Yeah, it's common that people will have these two reactions after their first time in an improv training experience. One, they'll say, I found something that I didn't know I had. And the second will be, I'm surprised by how bonded I feel to this group, even after such a short period of time. And so I think that speaks to kind of creating these environments and accelerating the process of these environments that allow us to develop that psychological safety and develop that self-efficacy.
And building it over time. Speaking as a personal reflection, I partly am thinking of this podcast. I've taped around 70 of these episodes. And candidly, when I first started doing this, I was terrified. I found it really scary to just do these interviews. And it's to say, do I still have some anxiety in advance? Yes. Is it way less? Yes. And part of it has just been getting used to it. Like when you do something for the 70th time, it's a lot easier to be adaptable. And if you listen to some of the first tapings we did, I followed a very specific script. I had a specific system. And now we do research. I do a fair amount of research, but by and large, it's pretty much going with the flow. And it's an interesting, as we talk about this, as I reflect on this podcast experience, how that you build those adaptability muscles over time, and also how it reduces social anxiety. The other piece it made me think of was how doing this podcast and having so many conversations with so many different people in this kind of more artificial format, in the sense that we know we're being recorded, has influenced my conversation in life. Just because it's like every week I'm doing a simulated conversation, and sometimes I wonder, if somebody who had a lot of social anxiety, of which, candidly, I had sometimes at various points in my life have had pretty intense social anxiety, doing a podcast or just interviewing people is a good exposure for reducing it. So when you were saying that earlier about how improv can reduce social anxiety in adolescence, I relate from some of my own lived experiences.
Yeah, and it's almost as if the repetition or having the routine of it, where you're kind of forced into it, like, well, I'm signed up for this class every Wednesday night, or I've committed to 12 episodes this season. Having that structure around it and the repeat practice is critical, right? And that's where a lot of the academic research around improvisation comes from, kind of, is the repeat practice. However, there are some studies, like the one from Felsman, that shows that even just 20 minutes of improvisation actually leads to greater uncertainty tolerance. So there's kind of this prepping aspect that can be valuable from exposing ourselves to uncertainty, and then this sort of long-term development as well.
Yeah, a little bit can have a big impact, but also hearing from you that daily practice, and I think if there's one takeaway for our listeners, is how to build in those daily habits. When you think of the book, Atomic Habit, and there's, I'd say, a lot of writing around the fostering of habits. How to foster some kind of daily habit or regular habit that you build that adaptability muscle a little bit, because adaptability is going to help you in your personal life. It's going to help you in your career. The world is just getting more and more volatile, more and more uncertain. And for us to cope with these times, adaptability is a huge enabler. And it also helps us in so many other ways, as we've talked about in this episode, from creativity to resilience. It's a real enabler and unlocking other aspects of our human potential. Jay, it's been such a pleasure speaking with you. This is such an important topic. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast this afternoon.
You're welcome. Thank you. Gratitude to you. And I really appreciate your curiosity in all the topics that you explore. I think that's really admirable.
That's it for this week's episode of A New Wave Entrepreneurship. Stay connected with us via our socials and our email list. Subscribe to us in your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss our next episode. If you have feedback on today's episode, tweet us at Venture for Canada, that is Venture, the number 4, Canada, or email us at podcast@venture.canada.ca. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening. I'm Latifa Farah, and that was Scott Sturrett and Jay Reid. Until next time, stay safe, stay motivated, and stay grateful. A New Wave of Entrepreneurship is produced by Latifa Farah, and editing and mixing are also done by Latifa Farah. Basola Agamba is our editorial assistant. Mark Wallach and Premium Beat own the copyright and publishing rights related to the song used in this podcast.